under the umbrella of what I call the gateway of love, and this is the middle section in True Refuge, which is my book that's coming out next month. And so the last talk we did was on self-forgiveness, and tonight we'll be exploring letting go of blame, opening our heart in forgiveness and acceptance of others. And it's a topic that I try to visit as regularly as I can, because I've found that in our relationships with each other, whether it's overt hostility or very subtle levels of resentment and blame, it's what creates distance. So that's where we'll be going tonight. I got an email from one person that listens to the podcasts, and he was describing watching an improv group many years ago, and afterwards the people in the group were sharing some of their secrets, their trade secrets, and they described how one principle they operated by was no matter what anybody threw your way, no matter how much it seemed to derail or be kind of offbeat or even irritating, that their basic principle was to go with it, to accept it and to respond from that. And they described that when they didn't oppose or kind of get jolted by what another person threw their way, they actually had this resourcefulness that was much more creative and spontaneous and fun. It kept the flow of the evening going. And so I was really struck by that, how in a moment of judgment, when we're caught in that sense of you're doing something wrong, you're bad, we lose access to that creativity and spontaneity. It's like the aperture of what we are has narrowed. We have less access. So I love that in a way we're doing improv in life, because life doesn't cooperate. Have you noticed? I mean, people don't act the way we want them to or expect them to, and of course we don't either. But always, through our day, through our weeks, things don't go our way. And so there's this inquiry of what's our stance and how do we respond? Can we do a little more of what these improv actors are suggesting? And it can seem very idealistic to say, when somebody treats us in a way that really is hurtful, to accept it and go with it. And that's not really the point. The point is to not lock down in resentment, blame, non-forgiving, because then we have no flexibility to respond from our intelligence. So there's a anonymous quote that goes, "Who is it that's unhappy? The one who finds fault." Most of us, if we start tracking our day, if we really look closely, we'll notice that there are a certain number of moments that we're either in the mode of feeling like a victim in some way, are in some way superior. And if we're honest, we'll notice that others can appear as either an obstacle or an irritant, and sometimes as a disappointment, sometimes it's more subtle. So today, and this often happens to me, I feel like I'm kind of a magnet for whatever I'm going to talk about. It's very predictable. So today I had my, some pages open that I was kind of looking at, sensing what I might want to, explore and reflect on together with you. And I got a call. I'd been kind of hounding this group that had, this company that had given us, installed a generator. I live in an area where trees come down, they just keep on falling down. So we lose power a lot. And since I work at home and my husband Jonathan does, this became really important. Well, the generator's been out since Hurricane Sandy, and they've been very non-responsive. So finally, I'm talking to this woman and realizing this, I'm looking at these pages saying, well, when you're blaming, there's heat and there's anger and you're tight. And I'm sitting there feeling completely in that trance of, And so I want to share a little bit as I go through the night, just that experience of feeling righteously wronged and how seductive it is to lock into it, and how much more pleasant it is to be angry and push your point across and make the other person feel small than it is to, in some way, process it within your own body. It's a very uncomfortable energy. It's much, much easier to lash out than it is to metabolize anger. Okay, so we'll come back to that. But I'd like to invite you, because I feel like just to ground it, let's just see where we are together, to take a moment to reflect. And this is just a very simple reflection on where you might be carrying some sense of resentment or blame in your life. So just to close your eyes if you like, and you might begin by sensing your closest circle, whether you have children, parents, siblings, close friends, just sensing if there's any subtle or not so subtle level of feeling wronged or let down, intolerant, if there's aversive judgment. And see if you can do this very simple scanning without adding more judgment. Just notice. You might sense if you work with other people, if there's any subtle or not so subtle blame, resentment, judgment in that domain. You might sense in the world of politics, whether you move around with having a strong aversive judgment towards people that disagree with you. If there's certain types of people that you're aware of, whether you have a bias against people with certain sexual orientations, certain races, ethnicities. The beginning of this path of awakening the heart is to realize where we're at war. And sometimes it's really overt, sometimes it's a quiet kind of putting down. And just as we did last week, to look at ourselves, just to become aware of our habit of pushing others out of our heart is the beginning of opening our hearts. Now, you can open your eyes if you'd like. So we were exploring a little bit of this. I did a day-long this weekend, and sharing how, within political groups, there's a lot of fractions that are, at war with each other. Within religious communities, it's the same way. It's wherever people disagree. And one of my favorite stories on this line I shared this weekend, and some of you might remember, was a kind of a conflict with a Taoist Master. These Confucianists were very upset with him because he would sit in this mountain hut and meditate naked. And they felt like that was really an appalling thing to do. So a group of them climbed the mountain to lecture him on proper behavior. And they saw him sitting naked as usual, and they were shocked. And so they asked him, "What are you doing sitting in your hut without any pants on?" And the sage replied, "This entire universe is my hut. this little hut is my pants. What are you fellows doing inside my pants? So I want to spend time on this theme because I feel like for each of us on our spiritual path, it takes a real commitment. And it takes time and energy to begin to track our own judgments, and rather than play out and live inside the beliefs that others are wrong, be willing to check inside and sense what's going on inside us. So it's a daily practice. And maybe I'll begin by saying, well, what is the process of forgiving? And if forgiving is a word that doesn't resonate for you, accepting when you have rejected, what's the process of reopening and accepting? And it begins, the most key place is recognizing what is the storyline that you're telling yourself. That this person's wrong or bad or less than. What's the storyline? And can you step out of that storyline of blame and just open to the feelings inside you that are living underneath the story? That's the nutshell summary of the entire process. Can you say, okay, here's my storyline, like today when I was on the phone, and between the phone calls, I knew my storyline, that this was really important to our household, that when the energy, when power goes off, what happens is that, and it's happened 4 times in the last few weeks, is that my computer goes down, and then sometimes I lose information. And if I'm writing something, that leads me to being extraordinarily upset. I get very freaked out, and then okay, let go. But it's upsetting. So here I am between these phone calls thinking about how important it is to me, and then saying, okay, so my storyline is that this particular person, the secretary that's responding to these calls, is responsible for causing a lot of trouble to me. That's my storyline. Can I sense what's underneath it? So between underneath it, I was finding, powerless. It's about power outages, but I was feeling powerless. And in that powerlessness was fear, because I lose what's on my screen, and then I don't get things done, and then I'm not prepared, and then I'm embarrassed, and then I fail. So it kind of unfolded into that. So I was with that some. That's the process of forgiving. It's to be with what's vulnerable inside us, rather than fueling this repeating of the storyline. Now I want to step back and say that anger has an intelligence to it. This is not a kind of an invitation to get rid of anger and just sit and process your own stuff. We have to pay attention to anger because it's part of our survival equipment. I needed to feel stirred up so I could be proactive and take care of this. But that's not all that we do. We don't get stirred up and get proactive and take care of. We tend to lock into ongoing inner narrative about what's wrong with this person or this situation. So it builds up in us. So the bodily reaction is way overblown, which of course, what's the effect on another person when we are overreactive? We don't get what we want because that person becomes defensive. Basically, by not stepping out of our aversive thoughts and really taking the time with what's going on in us, we're perpetuating the cycle of war. We overreact, somebody overreacts, it just keeps distance. So one of the ways that we do it is that we cause trouble to others when we overreact. Rita Rutner puts it this way. She says, my grandmother buried 3 husbands. 2 were only napping. So we overreact. We also get in this habit of experiencing difficulty and lashing out, and it's not always so reasonable. My examples are from Dear Abby, letters that she admitted she was at a loss to respond to. One woman writes, Dear Abby, I have a man I can't trust. He cheats so much, I'm not even sure the baby I'm carrying is his. Did you get it? It's a sleeper a little, right? Dear Abby, I suspected my husband's been fooling around, and when confronted with the evidence, he denied everything and said it would never happen again. Well, I won't go on with these, but you get the idea. So I sometimes, when I'm talking about this, I think of our dog. We had a large standard poodle, a super-sized poodle, Hakuna. And when I lived in Bethesda, we'd go on these walks, and Hakuna hated the neighborhood Akitas. There were a couple of Akitas that lived nearby. And whenever I'd go for a walk and I'd see them at a distance, what I'd have to do was wrap the leash around the tree and hold on, because Hakuna was 85 pounds of pure muscle. And I'm not that big a person. So I'd have to wrap around this tree, and then he'd lunge and I'd hold on for dear life. But after they were gone, he'd go back to sniffing around and trotting cheerfully. He wasn't mulling in his brain, oh, those damn Akitas, they think they own the hood, those fancy curly tails, the next time I'm going to show them. It's like he didn't... But I think about that because, they just go back to... But when we feel injured, we just fixate. And that's what our minds do, they fixate. And sadly, not only do they fixate, we're hooked on getting back. We have that vengefulness. So the inquiry is, how do we stop the proliferation, stop the fixation, stop the overreaction? I remember right after September 11th, a lot of people had that fear of exactly what happened, which was a vicious kind of spiraling that would only lead to more violence. There was a wonderful Cherokee legend that spread through the web, and in it an old grandfather was speaking to his grandson about what causes violence and cruelty in the world. And he said, in each human heart there are two wolves battling one another. One is fearful and angry, and the other is understanding and kind. The young boy looked intently into his grandfather's eyes and asked, which one will win? And the grandfather smiled and quietly said, whichever one we choose to feed. In more recent years, I've kind of reflected on that, and really the different parts of our brain that this talks about. And we need them all. We need to have the anger and feel the energy, and we need to listen and respond intelligently. But if we feed it by believing our thoughts of you're bad, you're wrong, then we are fueling the cycles of violence. So how do we listen intelligently to the anger, but then call on, in this case, the wolf that's wise and understanding? Okay? So what this really brings us to is, well, what would motivate us? Because as I mentioned, it's actually addictive. Anger is addictive because there's a pleasantness to the rush. I mean, letting out anger actually has a pleasant feeling. Of course, what it stokes is more letting out of anger. But in the moment, it feels pleasant. And so what would encourage us to really commit to forgiving, to letting go of blame and resentment? And my sense is that in each of us, there is a place of wisdom that knows that to be free and to have our hearts free to love without holding back, to have that experience, that direct realization of really belonging, that it requires feeding that part of our being that's more wise and more understanding. In other words, it requires a commitment to not stay in that trance of blame. There's a part of us that knows that. There's a part of us that intuits that a forgiving heart is intrinsic to the path of freedom. We know that. And it's a very hot subject now in conferences and professional conferences and research at major universities. I'm thinking of Stanford as one with the Compassionate Care Center they have there in Berkeley, University of Oregon. So there's this whole science developing on forgiveness. And the research has shown that it's linked to decreasing blood pressure and stress hormone levels, that there's less pain, less depression, fewer relapses in substance abuse. So it's got real good play in that way. But I think, to me, the deepest, most compelling reason to actively commit ourselves to reducing blame is the experience of who we are. That when we're in a place of blaming, we're living in a very tight, constricted, egoic experience of self. And when our heart is forgiving, we relax open into, we can't put words onto, but into a quality of beingness and connectedness that's something we cherish. Okay, so next reflection. Let me have you check this out. And take a pause. And in the pause, see if you can arrive, as much as we do with the guided practices, just feel yourself right here, aware of the sensations of sitting here, and aware of your breath. So you come home. And the invitation is to bring to mind a situation where you are resentful of somebody, where you feel blame. It could be low-level blame or feel real irritation or anger. And on these little reflections, if you can go right to a situation and sense, what's triggering you, you'll get more in touch with the experience, which is helpful. And just explore, what is it like in your body when you're feeling resentful? What does your heart feel like when you have blame, when you're carrying blame, when there's stories of blame? What's your sense of yourself? What's the felt sense of, okay, this is me? When you're full with aversive judgment, do you like yourself? If you'd like to just acknowledge, just sense, okay, so this is being mindful of the constellation of what it's like to be in an angry or blaming place. And for most of us, when we really pay attention to it, we can sense there's constriction, that we're not inhabiting the fullness of who we are. And our identity is confined to what I call a kind of reactive fragment of our being. So, in a way, you can consider this being in a trance. That whenever we're living in a small or narrowed part of our being, we've lost sight of the big picture. We've lost sight of the fullness of who we are, and we're forgetting our tenderness, and we're forgetting our creativity, and we're forgetting our natural intelligence. We're not even really feeling the flow of our whole body. We're just tight. Our senses are not open. We've lost sight of the awakeness and awareness that's here. And we lose sight of the other person. When we're in blame, we're only seeing what's wrong with that person. We are sorting for what's wrong. There's a filter in our brain. That's a trance. So I think it's helpful to just sense, well, whenever we're in blame mode, we're in a trance. It doesn't mean that the anger doesn't have an intelligent message, but we've locked into something that makes us smaller than we are and the other smaller than they are. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. So what Joko Beck says, this is a Zen teacher on the West Coast, is this. She says, our failure to know joy is directly linked to our inability to forgive. Our failure to know joy is directly linked to our inability to forgive. So it may be just mild blame or huge rage, but in the moments when we're in judgment, aversive judgment, the biochemistry and spirit and openness of joy is something that we're just cut off from it. Cut off from it. Now, the challenge is that forgiving, many of us could be sitting here going, yeah, well, forgiving's a good thing. And most people think it's a really good idea until they actually have something to forgive, right? So let's check that out now, because what I'm going to ask you to do, as I often do towards the end of this talk, is to choose somebody that you'd like to explore opening some, letting go some around, letting back into your heart a bit, and exploring that. But let's start with just a leading up reflection. Again, I ask you to maybe close your eyes and let the attention go inward. And again, to let this be a pause so you can come into your body. You'll find that in any of these reflections, if you re-enter your body, we cut off pretty quickly. Feel your breath, feel your hands, feel your feet. And see if you can, from the inside out, just feel the chest, belly. Know that you're here. And then bringing to mind, again, a situation where there's distance with another person, where there's judgment or blame, where you feel you've kind of locked into that, into feeling some aversion, some sense of this person's wrong, maybe victimized by the person or really superior to them, but in some way you've pushed them away. And take some time to sense the situation and remind yourself of how come. And if you find there's nobody in your personal life that you feel this is going on with, you might find that there's somebody in the political realm. Usually there's somebody that we have aversion to and we think is in some way bad or wrong. And the question that I'd like to ask you is, what would you have to feel if you put aside the blaming thoughts? If you just noted, okay, these are blaming thoughts, I'm going to put them aside for now. What would be the difficult experience underneath them that you'd have to connect with? What would you have to feel in your body and your heart? And you can keep on exploring that inside you, but when you're ready to open your eyes, and let's just hear a little bit of what's in the room. Just raise your hand and speak loudly. I'll just point. And what's the feeling under there that you'd have to connect with if you put aside the blaming thoughts? It's difficult to feel. Yeah. Sadness. So you'd have to come face to face with sadness. Right. Impotence. Right. So a lot like I was feeling, that kind of powerless feeling, and there's some fear with that for me. So yeah, impotence. Thank you. Yeah, way back there. Rejection. Feeling pushed away ourselves. Yeah. Grief. Yeah. Yeah. By the way, there's no right answer. It's just there's different kinds of feelings. Yeah, I see a hand there. I'm sorry? Failure. Right. Yeah. Doormat. So the sense of being stepped on and doormat. Yeah. Yeah. Fear. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Back there? Yeah, I see you. Compassion. Okay, so compassion now. Let me just ask you to think, if compassion was what you'd feel, what would stop you from just dropping the blaming thoughts if you could land right in compassion? Or do you find that you can? I'm sorry?
I pictured Bernie Madoff.
Yeah.
I try to understand, I think what he did is terrible. But I try to understand how he gone through in his younger life,
Okay.
I'm just trying to put myself in shape.
Great. So Bernie Madoff was in the room. It's great. That's a very good one. And so, and somebody that's caused a lot of pain to others. And the inquiry is, trying to understand anybody that causes suffering is suffering. And I'm trying to understand that. And if our minds can go down that track, we can find out a lot. But if we've been personally wounded, if we're one of the people that is, our entire life has changed, the ground has been pulled from underneath us because of what he did, we might first have to feel our sense of the fear, the hurt, the pain, just our life being pulled apart. So sometimes there's a step before compassion, and yet compassion is what's possible. So thank you to each of you, because when you start sensing what's underneath blame, you also start sensing why it's so hard to let go of the narrative that we hang out in. It's much easier to keep making someone else wrong than to touch the impotence, or to touch the fear, or the grief, or the sadness, or the feeling of being a doormat. Much easier. So what we discover is that not forgiving someone is protecting us from a deeper rawness. It's an armor. Okay? And it's an armor because it's easier to blame than feel the woundedness. I remember seeing a cartoon with a dog on a therapist's couch, and the dog saying, he's got a dog psychiatrist, and he's saying, I bark at everything. You can't go wrong that way, And in a way, that's the kind of how we are. It's like, whatever's coming at us, it's that reaction because, it's too dangerous not to. So, and we also sense that there's some fear around putting down the blame, that then we're going to actually adopt another belief, which is, oh, if you're not wrong, then I'm wrong. Okay? And the worst part, when I explore with people the whole process of forgiving, is the fear that if I forgive, if I stop blaming, this person's going to keep on hurting me. And so there's a sense that forgiving means that we're letting go of all our boundaries, which isn't the case. I remember all know John Bradshaw's, the shame guy. He wrote a book about shame, and there was a cartoon, and John Bradshaw was dressed up in a safari kind of outfit, and he had been strung up to a tree, so he's dangling from these branches, and he's got a whole mess of lions circling around him. They're assessing the situation, and the leader of the pack says his name is Bradshaw, that he understands that as cubs we were brought up in single-parent prides, that we're acting from deprivation and shame. I say we eat them, And it's like, so we can be compassionate, but we're afraid that we have this fear that if we're compassionate, what's going to happen? We'll get creamed. So I want to just say at this point that this commitment to forgiving, to letting go of the story of blame, is not like saying we're going to let go of our discrimination, our intelligence that lets us know how to protect ourselves and others. You can have wise discrimination and say, if I do this, this person's going to do that, or I can't trust this person to treat me well, but not feel hate or aversion in your heart. There's a difference between aversive blame and discrimination. And we can forgive someone and decide to never see them again. We can forgive someone and decide to divorce them. We can forgive someone and, and completely say our truth the way we most mean it, but we're no longer pushing that person out of our hearts. That's the difference.